indeed. I have no doubt that at some point in my lifetime, a former metropolitan university in this country will get a grant from the EU to examine why no one ever sits in the front row at an event like this. And I do just owe you a small apology. One thing, I'm very mindful none of you is quite as decrepit as I am. One thing you will find, if you get to the age of 48 and you're still too vain to wear spectacles in public, then if you speak in public, you always find that the lectern is a little bit further away than it was the time before. We're mindful that today the lectern is very slightly above my knees. You will forgive me if I speak without notes. Now, you kindly referred to some of the things in which Stonewall's been engaged, and I do think sometimes those of us who live in this country at the beginning of the 21st century can almost become a tiny bit complacent, and it's certainly friends, and I have both friends and relatives in America, are starkly aware of how little legislative protection many gay people have throughout the world, whereas in fact in this country, in the last 6 years alone, we have seen not just the complete decriminalisation of acts among gay people between 16 and 21, which is a very real historic poison. We've seen the introduction of gay people into the armed services. We've seen the equalisation of the law around both fertility, treatment and adoption. We've seen huge progress in education with the abolition of Section 28 and a new Equality Act, which in some sense is going to do the exact opposite of what Section 28 did, which is positively require schools to support their lesbian and gay pupils. And we've also seen a new offence of incitement to hatred and hate crime protections to match similar protections around race and gender and disability. And of course we've seen civil partnership, which affords lesbian and gay people in this country every single one of the rights and entitlements of heterosexual marriage, the rights and entitlements, of course, which most heterosexuals take for granted from the day they're born. But in spite of that catalogue of positive and progressive changes, I'm certainly very alive to the fact that there has been and remains quite active opposition to equality in this country from small pockets of people and specific interest groups. One of them, I have to say, is a rather odd organisation which styles itself the Christian Institute. Now, that's not just odd because so often they don't sound terribly Christian at all when you listen to what they have to say. But if you go onto their website, you'll see the sorts of things the Christian Institute is interested in. They are in favour of spanking, and they are against prostitution, and they are against pornography, although curiously they seem very keen to share with you details of many of the sorts of pornography they are against. And I was reminded on the way here about an encounter I had actually exactly 5 years ago with someone from the Christian Institute. And 5 years ago, our plans for civil partnership during the summer of 2004 were actually wrecked in the House of Lords. They were sabotaged, so we had to go back to the House of Commons and go through the committee stage and put the bill back together. And it was one very warm afternoon, just like this, that I popped out of the committee session in the Commons, and I went to the loo. And there, in the loos, and you can imagine what the loos are like in the House of Commons, marble floor, wooden panelling, a row of urinals stretching into the middle distance, and there at the very far urinal was the policy director of this organisation called the Christian Institute. Now, the boys among you, perhaps not the girls, will be aware that in such circumstances there is an etiquette. If someone is standing at the urinal as far away from you as possible, you conversely should do exactly the same. Stand as far away from him as you can too. So, mindful of this etiquette and of course of my obligations to Stonewall, I went and stood at the urinal immediately next to the man from the Christian Institute, and I said, "How are you?" Because I noticed he'd been taking some Nurofen earlier on. I said, "How are you?" And he said, "I'm not well. People like you make me feel ill." And I was able to share with him that at Stonewall we say no to the use of pharmaceuticals, that at times of stress we prefer to rely instead upon the nourishment that comes from the power of prayer. And I can say that ever since then, whenever I have bumped into the gentleman from the Christian Institute, he has looked at me in rather an odd way. But he is still there, as are so many others, campaigning against legislative equality. And I will just explain, and I'm not a guy who's greatly into semantics, why the word equality is important to us. Something you'll often read in papers like the Daily Mail is that, we're campaigners for gay rights. Well, actually, we're not really campaigners for gay rights. I've never wanted a single gay right in my life. I, like so many other lesbian and gay people, have just wanted exactly the same rights that everyone else takes for granted, and exactly the same treatment and exactly the same respect. But, of course, when in 2003 we saw the one bit of the legislative jigsaw I've not mentioned yet, which was workplace equality, protection from discrimination at work, introduced, there were exactly the same sort of objections we've seen to so much of our work. And I've already drawn attention to my age, so it doesn't matter if I do it again. I'm old enough to remember, as I fear not a single one of you is. Once again, I emphasise any reference to my age in relation to yours is a reference to my decrepitude as opposed to your healthy youth. I'm old enough to remember the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, which of course provided equality at work to women for the very first time in this country. And in the run-up to the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act, there were letters almost every day in the letters column of the Daily Telegraph and the Times, and they were from the principals of Oxbridge colleges and retired brigadiers and permanent secretaries in Whitehall. And they were all complaining that all this equality stuff was all very good, and they had no objection to fair treatment for women at all. But there was a problem that had been overlooked, and it was that they all inhabited listed buildings, and it would cause terrible problems if they were required to provide women's lavatories in every one of these listed buildings. Well, miraculously, of course, the Sex Discrimination Act was introduced 30 years ago. We've got through the intervening years of our noble island history without invasion or plague being caused as a consequence of the desecration of listed buildings for the purpose of complying with the Sex Discrimination Act. And I was reminded of all that once again in December 2003 when our workplace protections came in. And it was on the morning of Monday, the 1st of December 2003, and I was reading the Daily Mail. I read the Daily Mail so Stonewall supporters don't have to. And there, among its usual catalogue of scare stories, and those of you who see the Mail occasionally will know about these, you know, fresh hair causes cancer, if children play hopscotch, they'll get housemaid's knee. There on page 2, among this catalogue of scare stories, was a firm prediction drawing attention to these new protections to stop gay people just being sacked for being gay. And the Daily Mail claimed that as a consequence, within months, thousands and thousands of avaricious homosexuals would be suing their employers for hundreds of thousands of pounds. Well, of course, curiously, like so many predictions in the Daily Mail, it didn't actually turn out to be true. And something we can certainly say from our perspective at Stonewall is that hardly ever do we come across people who just want to sue their employers for thousands and thousands of pounds. Almost always, where we do come across people who have difficulties at work that are related and genuinely related to their sexual orientation, all they actually want to do is have the difficulties resolved so that they can continue to do the job and pursue the career that they have chosen. And it was mindful of this that we set up a good practice programme for employers, what we called our Diversity Champions programme in 2002, in preparedness for the introduction of these regulations. Now, that programme happily now engages Google. It engages 500 major employers in this country. And if you look on our website, you can see that those employers do not, in some sense, feature the necessary usual suspects of progressive workplace activity. They include IBM and Barclays and McKinsey in the private sector, and the Royal Navy, and now the Army and MI5 in the public sector. And as I think most of you will appreciate, those aren't the sort of workplaces where people sit around in circles holding hands and singing Kumbaya. They are actually workplaces that are absolutely focused on maximising shareholder value in the private sector, or indeed on delivering world-class public services in the public. And we don't see those objectives as being inimical to the delivery of equality and fair treatment in the workplace. We see the delivery of equality and respect and fair treatment for employees and staff as a way of delivering some of those organisational objectives. I did actually point out to some people a few weeks ago that it's interesting to me that with 5 million people now going to work every day in this country for a Stonewall Diversity Champion, that means there are 5 times as many people going to work for an employer with whom we engage than there are who now go to the Church of England every Sunday. And I think that tells us something about the way this country is changing at the beginning of the 21st century. When I pointed that out, actually at the offices of the CBI, I was told I sounded very liberal. So I was able to reassure the gentlemen, as they all were, at the CBI, that in fact, if current trends continue, within 2 years' time, there will be more people going to work in this country every day for a Stonewall Diversity Champion than are actually trades unionists. For some reason, that brought a smile to the faces of the gentlemen above the offices of the CBI, but it is a demonstration of the fact we don't kind of regard this as a political activity with a capital or even necessarily a small p. We regard it as a way of unlocking value within people's workplaces. And I'll just say something, if I may, about 3 or 4 of the key interventions that we've developed or engage in through our workplace activities in an attempt to help unlock some of that potential from workforces. I mean, one of them, which sounds kind of stunningly obvious, and to people who are as cutting edge as all of you are in terms of what you do at work, the idea of setting up and publishing a lesbian and gay recruitment guide for graduates 4 years ago. We're about to publish our 5th. Doesn't sound radical at all, but in fact, we've been surprised at the huge amount of engagement we've had from people, undergraduates and postgraduates who are about to qualify because for the first time they've had access to a resource which has indicated to them which employers might take them seriously. And I have to say, I find that a wholly healthy development. There's no doubt whatsoever, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, most gay people would never have dreamt of going to an employer and saying, you know, will you actually support my personal and professional development if I'm gay? I think actually quite a lot of women and people from black and minority ethnic communities wouldn't have done that either. Of course, happily, younger people nowadays are much more assertive about what they want from their workplace, to which quite often they're going to commit not just huge hours, but actually many years of their working lives. And we're delighted that young lesbian and gay and bisexual students are now prepared to say to employers, you know, we don't want to be assured we're going to be treated differently, we just want to be assured we will be treated with the same respect as everyone else in your workplace. And I have to say, one of the most interesting feedbacks we've had from the University Careers Service in the last 18 months, which now distributes that guide, is that they have actually found young heterosexual women using the Stonewall recruitment guide too, because they acknowledge that so many employers, precisely 30 years after the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act, have kind of learned to talk the talk around gender and indeed race. No employer would say we don't really do anything around women, and you know, if you're a woman, we won't take your career development or your work-life balance very seriously. But employers who are prepared in 2007 and 8 and 9 to be saying we take issues of sexual orientation seriously, one of the most tricky issues to deal with in some workplaces, that gives a signal, it's a benchmark to lots of cohorts of potential recruits, that this is a sensitive and progressive workplace. I'll mention another, one of our interventions, which I'm sad Google has not yet engaged in, but that was the introduction of an annual workplace equality index to showcase the 100 or 150 best employers for gay people in Britain. And again, we know that that is used widely by potential recruits, not to find out if they will somehow be celebrated for being gay if they turn up in a workplace, but to find out if they are actually considering working somewhere that feels reasonably chilled and relaxed and supportive about people regardless of difference. And one of the hugely positive and exciting developments for us in that piece of work every year was that for the publication of this year's index, it's published in January, so next year's will come out in 6 months' time. For the publication of this year's index, we for the first time allowed and indeed encouraged employees of participating organisations to personally give testimony about how they felt their employer performed in terms of providing a supportive environment for lesbian and gay staff. And the thing that we were, well, I can't just say hugely delighted about, but as any of you who've ever kind of done diagnostic research will also know, the feeling hugely relieved about was, for the first time, we evidenced that staff were genuinely expressing levels of higher satisfaction at work in those workplaces that were scoring well in our index. In other words, in the workplaces that were doing the sort of things that we're encouraging them to do. And those of you who specialise or work in the area of kind of people or human capital will know that that actually is a hugely important feature of any of this kind of work, to be able to actually demonstrate it's not just kind of generally a good thing or it involves compliance with a legal framework, to be able to demonstrate that relatively low-level investment in some of these issues leads to demonstrably higher levels of staff satisfaction is actually hugely important. And we were delighted to see that happening. A third area of our interventions I'll mention, because it is becoming more important, is our work around leadership. We developed with some people from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard a leadership program for next generation lesbian and gay leaders. We're actually moving it this year from Henley to Ashridge. And the reason that is critically important to us is twofold. First, we do take the view that people who are gay, and those of you who aren't, hold on one moment, don't want to cause you any distress, we'll get there. We do take the view that people who are gay may have unique skills. Now, that doesn't make them better than people who aren't gay, just as it doesn't make people who are black better than people who are white as employers. But we are mindful that actually people who come from minority communities, whether they be black or Asian or lesbian and gay, have grown up not only knowing how to engage with people who are different from them, but with an imperative of having to engage with people who are different from them. And in many 21st century workplaces, that is a hugely useful tool. And I can certainly say, I mean, one of the first weeks I was at Stonewall, Larry Hurst, who was then in charge of IBM in this country, said to me, and he was very refreshingly candid, I think that is something can be said about IBM around some of these issues. He was very candid that 30 years ago, an ideal recruit to IBM was, whether they admitted it or not, a straight white man who had 2 children and had played rugby at university. And the reason for that was that 90% of the people that guy would work with would be straight white men who had 2 kids and had played rugby at university. And probably 90% of the clients he would come across would be straight white men who had 2 kids and had played rugby at university. So it made perfect commercial sense for them to be recruiting people who felt comfortable in that kind of environment. And of course, as Larry acknowledges, and certainly everyone here does, the reality in 2009 is that any recruit to IBM operating in a global business that actually has got a hugely varied workforce is not going to get on terribly well if there's only a small cohort of staff they can engage with. And similarly, anyone working externally for IBM, which is almost every single one of their staff, is actually operating in a global market where they will be dealing with people who are profoundly different in every way on almost every day of the week. So there are opportunities for, we believe, for leaders, for next generation leaders, to develop some of their personal skills based on learning lived experience of their own lives, which, as I say, does not make them better than heterosexuals. It just means that possibly they have a skill base that can be developed and enhanced more quickly on that basis. And I do just say the other reason we are doing work on next generation leadership is actually precisely because of the work we've been doing around graduate recruitment. And we have seen in the last 2 years alone a significant change of sentiment among young people, among people in the recruitment market, who are now saying, well, if we go somewhere, we expect they'll be aware of the law, we expect they'll treat us with respect, the real test for us about whether we will be supported and nurtured if we're lesbian or gay, or indeed if we're black or Asian, the real test of that for an employer is when an employer can say, I can guarantee you that your career progression will be exactly the same as anyone else's. And the only way employers can demonstrate that authentically, of course, is by saying, all you need to do is look at the top of our business. Half the most senior people are women, 20% of them are black and Asian, 10% of them are openly lesbian and gay and feel able to be openly lesbian and gay within our corporate environment. And it is those businesses that are starting to develop competitive advantage in some of these quite tight labour markets because, as I said, they can demonstrate authentically not just that they believe in supporting people from all sorts of backgrounds within their workplace, but that people have been supported and helped to progress their careers. And I'll just mention, finally, in relation to workplace, something we've started doing, and we've only started doing because no one else had ever done it, and that is research, not just the kind of the slightly more diagnostic stuff around the Workplace Equality Index and performance, but actually for the first time, and actually last year with the support of IBM, around productivity. And we are starting to develop an evidence base, which of course is perfectly intuitive. It's not actually rocket science. We are starting to develop an evidence base which proves conclusively for the first time that when people can be completely open and relaxed at work, when people can be themselves, they perform better. And as I said, that's something we've known for some years. It's one of those challenges to convert those sorts of assertions into the tougher, hard evidence. We're now clear that we're beginning to see that. And I will just mention, if I may, one other area of our work at present, which is important to us because I think there's a significant connectedness, and that is around schools and homophobic bullying. Now, the reason that I think there's a connectedness is twofold. First, of course, the reality in schools is exactly the same as in workplaces. If young people who are growing up feel they are able to be themselves, they are more likely to be productive and successful. And we are actually, in the next couple of years, going to start looking at some of those correlations around children, young people in secondary schools. But the other reason we think that this work in schools challenging homophobic bullying is terribly important is that, quite rightly, there are employers, not just the armed services, I might say, the gentlemen at the CBI, other employers who say, well, we don't like people being homophobic or sexist or racist, but they arrive out of our education system with those prejudices, and we are somehow being expected to challenge those prejudices once they've entered the workplace. Well, it seems to us it's perfectly proper those prejudices should be challenged as early as they emerge. And certainly our Education for All programme, which was set up, I think, 4 years ago and is now supported by a coalition of 70 national organisations ranging from children's charities to teaching unions, that programme has actually uncovered some deeply disturbing evidence. We did the first ever survey a couple of years ago of young people growing up lesbian and gay in British secondary schools, and that found that 60% of them, more than 60%, were regularly the victims of homophobic bullying. A third of those, 1 in 5 of that group of young people, were regularly the victims of physical homophobic bullying, and perhaps most shocking of all, a third of those incidents of bullying were actually being perpetrated by adults in the schools that those young people were attending. And some of the young people we've met, we're actually about to hold our first residential programme starting on Thursday for for young lesbian and gay people to help them develop their own programs for challenging homophobic bullying in schools. But some of those young people we've met have been hugely arresting. And I came across a guy a couple of years ago now who was at a school in West London, and he said, well, finally, after 2 years, the school had done something to stop him being assaulted going to and from school. And the school, in fact, had not dealt with the perpetrators. They had provided him with a security guard to accompany him home at the end of the school day. And last year, we came across a girl who was at a faith school in the West Country, and she perhaps incautiously had said to one of her teachers at the age of 14 she thought she might be lesbian. And when that girl contacted us, she had since that disclosure been required to sit outside the changing rooms at the beginning and end of sports lessons while the normal children got changed. And we're certainly alive to the fact that if those sorts of prejudices aren't addressed and challenged in schools, then of course it's no surprise that people grow up validated in a belief that not just abusing but attacking lesbian and gay people is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And in the last 3 years alone, we've seen the murder of Jodie Dabrowski in South London, we've seen the murder of Michael Causer in Liverpool last year, and there was an incident 6 or 7 months ago, a young man, Ollie Helmer, in East London, who was attacked with a broken bottle by a man screaming homophobic abuse, and that bottle severed his spinal cord, and he will never walk again. And that took place in what is meant to be one of the most tolerant and diverse and progressive cities in this country. So we are under no illusions about the challenges that still face us, but we are driven, and we continue to be driven by our vision. And at Stonewall we do have a vision of a Britain where one day every single person will not just be entitled to fair treatment and respect, but will be afforded fair treatment and respect. And we have a vision of a Britain where one day every single child will grow up to secure every ounce of their potential. And we have a vision of a Britain where one day no human life will be overshadowed by hatred or prejudice or fear. And I know that there are some of you who have already helped us. We hope there are many of you in future who will help us in building that Britain within our lifetimes, and we're very grateful to you indeed. I was told to talk for 40 minutes, and it's now 20 to 2.
Right on the nail. Thank you very much, Ben. Has anybody got any questions?
I saw there was a gay soldier on the front cover of the Army magazine. What's your opinion on the attitudes within the Army today?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, actually. The gays in the military thing is something where some gay people, I gave an address a few years ago and was asked to list kind of how things were going. And I mentioned gays in the military, and dear old Peter Tatchell was sitting in the audience and started shouting out, "Shame, shame!" And, I have to say our view of the gays in the military issue is simply that gay people should have the right to serve their country if they wish to do so in exactly the same way as everyone else. And certainly, since we've been doing, the Royal Navy was the first of the armed services we started work with 3.5 years ago. The Navy we started with at the beginning of last year. I think there is no reason, and I'm unlike our very good friend Peter, I'm always slightly cautious about making grandiose claims without evidence, but I think there is no reason to think that lesbian and gay people are not as widely represented in the armed services already as they are in the wider population. the simple fact is an awful lot of them have never felt able to come out, and an awful lot of them, of course, in those particular occupations, challenge some of the preconceptions about what lesbian and gay people look like. And I think one of the most difficult things we've dealt with, and we're aware that there are currently lesbian and gay personnel serving still in Iraq. There are some in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in theatres of active service. But I think something we're alive to is the fact that quite often, and it's not unique for uniformed services, they still find it extremely difficult to come out. If you've worked in a small cohort of people for 15 years and never been, in which you do get put in quite pressured, so, even more pressured than doing a pitch to a client, to actually be able to turn around after all that time and say, well, there's something I've never told you, can still be really challenging for them. But something I'm, really chuffed about is we are aware that within the last few months there have been personnel from the US Navy at Portsmouth talking to people about the work we've been doing, and I think you can probably draw your own conclusions about the reason they're there and why they think that that might be a sensible thing to be preparing for.
You mentioned the church sort of tangentially a few times. As an active but liberal Christian, that sort of interests me. Do you have any sense of how much of the opposition you run into at least claims to be faith-based, and how much active support are you getting from sort of more liberal wings of the church?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever a significant part of the opposition to equality in this country, and actually quite often a significant part of the opposition to equality for women in this country, has been faith-based. However, as with so many people who claim to speak on behalf of large numbers of other people, we're not convinced there is the evidence for that. And certainly we know, I mean, we did a piece of research about a year ago into the views of people of faith around Britain about homosexuality. And we very deliberately, although we were asked to, didn't kind of go off and do a bit of research that said, well, if you read the Quran in this way, you'll all be gay, and if you read the Bible in this way, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. Because we know that the opponents of equality aren't susceptible to those arguments, so we could package them slightly more elegantly, but it wouldn't actually make any difference. What we did was go and talk through focus groups across actually the north of England, two groups of Christians and Sikhs and Muslims, and almost all of them were crystal clear that they were significantly less homophobic than their so-called faith leaders. And I am minded, and it's a very sensitive subject, and it's territory that's often not pushed at, because within the kind of British public realm, all you have to do is say, I'm a bishop, and somehow that is meant to entitle you to be taken more seriously than someone else who's wandered in off the street wearing a pink frock. And we have to be careful about it, but, I think it is important that that's challenged. And I know, this reveals me to be a real saddo. Last year I did watch probably the first 4 or 5 days of Big Brother. Regrettably this year, like the rest of the country, I've matured to watching none at all. And at the end of, I think it was the first week of Big Brother last year, there was a woman in the Big Brother house who got terribly upset because they had a fancy dress party and this guy called Mohammed wore a dress. And she told him off and she said, that's absolutely ridiculous. We're Muslims, Mohammed, you mustn't do this. People will think you're homosexual. Now, this woman had been drinking repeatedly. She, I use my words carefully here, did not seem to be a stranger to the details of sexual congress, even if presumably she had never had it herself. She certainly dressed immodestly. She smoked and she swore like a trooper. I have great difficulty in thinking that her objection to Muhammad wearing a dress was really motivated by her being a devout Muslim. You know, I am clearly of the view her objection to Muhammad wearing a dress is simply she's a bit homophobic. And I do think it's important that that sort of thing is challenged, and you know, you have to challenge it in the right way. And certainly, I wouldn't, you know, single out Muslims for one moment. I think they're Christians. You know, we shouldn't. There's no hierarchy of prejudice, and indeed, the people who seek to be prejudiced or to demonstrate their prejudice against minority communities in this country as if it's a virtue, are usually very keen to say, no, I'm more homophobic than the mere chief rabbi. But the simple fact is there is an awful lot of homophobia in this country that is kind of dressed up as religious belief. And you know, we only have to look, and again, I don't want to rehearse stuff that people have heard before, but at Leviticus, I mean, you know, bishops' wives are not cross-examined about whether they're having sex once they've ceased menstruating, which is as serious a failing as far as Leviticus is concerned as homosexuality. Yet miraculously, you know, we're just told, oh, that's all a little bit of history, and it's, you know, it shouldn't be taken too seriously, and the Old Testament is indicative, except of course when it's not.
Just kind of following up on that question, in terms of kind of organised kind of resistance to legislation, is that bishop-led?
I don't think it's bishop-led. I mean, I think there are a range. You know, there are some bishops who still sit in the House of Lords. I mean, frankly, if I was running a failing business, I would be encouraged to go back and tend to my customers rather than disappear to London for 3 days a month. But nevertheless, some of it is the more extreme bishops. You know, some of it is other fundamentalists of all sorts. You know, who don't like homosexuals. I mean, that's, you know, that's the reality. I mean, one of the interesting things that has happened in the last 10 years is I think they've, you know, and you only need to look at the sort of things that someone like Lord Tebbit nowadays says about homosexuals. A lot of these people have learned to speak in a slightly more well-mannered way because if they were saying nowadays the sort of things they felt it was perfectly acceptable to say in the public domain 10 years ago or 20 years ago, people would say, you know, I think you're a bit odd. So they've learned to be slightly more elegant about ventilating their prejudices. But I think exactly the same is true, actually, around, you know, lots of issues that involve women. You know, that people, you never get anyone nowadays saying, oh, we don't want women working in this office. What they'll do is they'll, you know, dress it up in all sorts of other concerns about career commitment and are they going to stay around and, you know, will they take time off and all of that kind of stuff. So it doesn't mean that the underlying prejudice among some small cohorts of the population is not still quite strong.
You mentioned working with some organisations that were 90% straight, white, male in their demographic. How do you engage with groups like that that might not have affiliation to any minority groups?
Well, I'm not sure I mentioned organisations nowadays that were 90% straight white male, but I think, and one of the core principles of the work we do around people is that it's actually about diversity and difference right across the board. Now that doesn't mean we don't then, you know, we won't then deliver strategies around sexual orientation, but we actually think you have to get that understanding in the first place. And one of the reasons for that is precisely that actually it's about respecting all sorts of differences. And I can say one of the most interesting things, and Barclays actually historically have been one of the businesses that are happier to share some of their internal stuff externally. One of the most interesting things I found in my first couple of years doing this work was at Barclays, where they started stratifying a number of cohorts of their workforce, including sexual orientation. And we encourage them to ask a question, do you feel comfortable at work? Because there are quite a lot of gay people who wouldn't quite articulate that they think they're the victims of homophobia, but actually just still don't feel that comfortable at work. So we introduced that as a question that was a proxy for satisfaction. One of the really fascinating responses to that research is that Barclays picked up a cohort of straight men who said they didn't feel comfortable at work, and when they did drilling down with their permission, when they say to staff, can we come back to you and ask you more details, they said yes they did, they found that this group of men were men who wanted to take advantage of family-friendly working, which lots and lots of women in Barclays were doing, but when they did it, they got picked on or teased. So women could say, oh, I'm going to work 8 till 3, and everyone says, that's fantastic. But a man who said the same was made to feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And that, it seems to me is a perfect example of how taking an approach that is right across the board about accommodating people, whatever their difference, or however they want to deliver their work, is actually a way of binding in commitment and understanding right across the piece too. There's one more.
I was just going to ask, what can we do? Are there small changes or big things? What would you like to see? What people?
Well, I think one of the because I always think it's easier sometimes just you can do we must all do the best, make the best effort in the best of all possible worlds, and it makes everyone feel very good, and then they go away and not quite sure what that means. I actually think one of the challenges organisationally is to say, are we going to be in a position in 5 years' time when we can say 6% of our highest paid staff are openly lesbian and gay, and actually start having that organisational discussion, because that's a clear objective. I mean, the 6% we use for the level of the lesbian and gay population because Treasury actuaries now use 6%. There used to be endless, some of you will know there used to be endless arguments over whether it was 10% or 2% or 20%. I find the moment you say that's what Treasury actuaries say, most people decide we'd rather not go and have a discussion. And we think, our sense is that's about the level, that's probably reasonably accurate. So will we be in a position at Google, in 5 years' time, we can say 6% of our 100 most, 6 of our 100 most senior people are completely open and relaxedly gay, and encouraging other people to follow their career patterns. And the way we'll get there, in terms of practical support, it is in many cases. I mean, we think mentoring at various levels is a very useful tool, and it's one we're developing at the moment. Sorry, the gentleman. Yes. Well, you just yes, don't.
Diversity special.
I don't know why. When was it requested? Do you know?
Well, it will have been requested.
It was probably exactly at the time that our
in
contact for Stonewall left.
Well, because it was last year and the year before, and this year's is not due until the 5th of September. And I do just say that, there are some organisations, and I don't know what clearly a decision was taken. There are some organisations where there's a sensitivity about doing that, because they say, what if we come 95th? Oh, exactly. Although here, I have to say, our index here is slightly more challenging than the HRC one, which enables you to get to 100%, and then everyone says, oh, isn't that fantastic? I mean, it is actually more challenging. But one of the reasons we feel completely comfortable, if someone is 95th in that index, they're still 95th of a group of 100. I mean, we don't do the kind of naming and shaming that the HRC one does in America, because we're just not sure it works in terms of getting organisations to change. But you can come 95th and still be celebrated. And the other thing people get sensitive about is they do move around. I think the Navy actually went down a little bit last year. The reason for that is quite simple, that the external labour market is constantly changing and actually improving. So if employers continue to do what they were doing last year or the year before, then actually in relative terms they will almost certainly become less preferred. And I do say, and I'll just say this briefly, it's one of the things we've quite often found with public sector employers, that there's a kind of sense in the public sector, certainly in local government, oh, you know, we were getting beaten up for doing equal opportunities 20 years ago, so we must be progressive. The problem is there are an awful lot of bits of the public sector who haven't really moved forward in the last 20. They're doing exactly what they were doing 20 years ago, when it was, when it really was radical and difficult and challenging. But if all they're doing is what they were doing a decade ago or 2 decades ago, then actually in comparison with an awful lot of other employers, they don't look that preferred. Now I'm mindful, and those of you who know us will know this too, that at Stonewall we always intend to deliver on time, on budget and above specification. So in order to meet at least the first of those KPIs, I need to stop now.